So this document dump that we had right before this motion began to be debated in this House revealed that, yes, the carbon tax is a significant drain on GDP. The carbon tax makes Canadians poorer. We are in a moment where Canada has the lowest GDP growth per capita in the G7. And it's not growth at all, Madam Speaker. It's negative growth. It's shrinking. The per capita GDP in Canada is shrinking. Canadians are getting poorer. This isn't an opinion of mine. This is a fact. This is per capita GDP. The wealth of this country divided by its people is shrinking. That is Canada in 2024, and we need to get off of that track, Madam Speaker. And the carbon tax is not helping it. It is a drain on GDP. This is a crisis of our economy, wherein the OECD predicts in the decades to come that Canada will be at the bottom of its peer countries. And the carbon tax contributes to this. The carbon tax harms the economy and makes Canadians poorer. We know it. The PBO has said this. The data that they have released supports the PBO's conclusions. The PBO was clear that this data would support his conclusions when he was at the testifying before the Finance Committee a couple of weeks ago. So, Madam Speaker, there are enormous problems facing this country, some of which have been raised by members of all sides in this debate so far today. Housing, we have a housing crisis. We have a crisis in the Canadian Armed Forces of recruitment and retention and non-availability of equipment and munitions. All of these things are going to require a strong economy. We need a growing economy where people are getting wealthier, not poorer, where people will be able to afford to buy a decent home in a safe neighborhood, where we will have the financial and economic capacity to fund a healthcare system that people depend on. We need a strong economy to be able to fund the desperately needed upgrades and enhancements to our national defense and our armed forces. All of these things are threatened by this government's lack of care for the state of our economy. They are insisting that the carbon tax system that they have created is somehow good for Canadians, even though it is suppressing GDP and making Canadians poorer. And they will, they are determined to stick to this despite the officers of Parliament who have told the officer of Parliament who has told us otherwise. And you know, what kind of a government that claimed and campaigned to be most open and transparent in Canadian history? In what scenario would an officer of Parliament have to resort to an ATIP to get information from the government? That they would have to formally go through and file an ATIP, and just like other journalists, politicians, researchers, and academics, be denied their ATIP. And this morning, they want extraordinary credit for the documents they dumped. They still haven't complied with either I took a quick look at the CBC story that came out about this. The CBC's ATIP hasn't even been complied with. The full disclosure has not been made, and yet the government is claiming some kind of, that they're some sort of heroes of openness because faced with a production order to be debated and voted on in this chamber, that they came out minutes ahead of it with a document dump. So the cover-up continues, the culture of cover-up continues, and it needs to stop.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Wow, that member just quoted the CBC. He better be careful. He might get kicked out of his caucus. I mean, you can say whatever you want about being pro-life, but talk about the CBC. That member better be very careful, Madam Speaker. He might get himself kicked out of caucus for quoting the CBC. You know, I find it fascinating how he's willing to accept in the data that was released this morning, the GDP information, but he won't accept the fact that it categorically says and proves proves 8 out of 10 Canadians are better off, and that the carbon tax has reduced emissions by 80 million tons of GHG emissions to date. If he accepts the GDP information, he has to accept the other information. But more importantly, when he does talk about GDP, the one thing that this doesn't have any data on is the cost of doing nothing. And the cost of doing nothing is greater than that $30 billion that he references in GDP. The cost of doing nothing is about $35 billion in 2030. Why won't this member talk about the cost of doing nothing? Isn't it just because the Conservatives don't want to do anything?
The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, Madam Speaker, he is continuing to mislead on what the report says and what the carbon tax does to Canadians. This whole discussion is about the economic impact of the carbon tax, and 8 out of 10 Canadians are not better off when you measure the economic impact. They are poorer. The GDP reduction proves that this is harmful to the economy, and the PBO has been clear all along that the economic cost of the carbon tax does not make Canadians wealthier.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Conservatives, talk on endlessly about the carbon tax. They break it down, in their own way, but there are lots of economists who say that it's good for lowering greenhouse gas emissions. Could they be a little bit more constructive or positive and say, if there wasn't a carbon tax, how would they lower greenhouse gas emissions? Just a little example, a concrete, specific example of what they would do to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
My colleague, who is our Shadow Minister for Environment, talked about that in his speech, and I want to say to my colleague from the bloc, who his colleagues seem to think that this motion was unworthy of debate or concern in this House. So do they think that it is okay for the Government of Canada to ignore requests for information with impunity, to gag the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to promise to Canadians openness and transparency, and deliver secrecy, obfuscation, and cover-up?
The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member. Madam Speaker, I can't help but think about how incredibly short-sighted it is for us to be talking about the economic impacts on Canadians today without looking at the costs of us doing nothing, as is brought up by my colleague, in the climate crisis. We know that the climate crisis has incredible economic costs. We know that there's going to be, let me put my glasses on, the national GDP, so the economic cost is likely to reduce national GDP by $25 billion by 2025. That's equivalent to $630 per person in lost income, and with low-income people being affected the most. We know this. So also, fighting increasingly destructive wildfires costs $1 billion a year, and these costs will only continue to rise. Now, does the member agree that the costs of the climate crisis need to be prioritized, and that we can't be ignoring that the climate crisis is happening as we speak?
Member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, I don't accept the premise of the member. It seems to be implied that the carbon tax is somehow delivering Canada from or making a significant impact on climate change. We heard from the member from Louis St. Laurent earlier that Canada ranks very poorly in its performance on emissions. So I don't accept the premise that the carbon tax is a solution to the problems that she has outlined. But I would also say to her and her colleagues, again, there was a time when NDP members were actually quite serious about transparency in government, about the functioning of Parliament, and they seem to have abandoned that while they're going to support the Liberals who will suppress information from an officer of Parliament and refuse to disclose information that is the property of Canadians.
Debate. The honourable